They're coming
"Dance
for
with
you.
me or
They
I'll
know
lose my
everything. You
patience,"
must leave
the
the
Alpha
city
King said,
immediately.
and every man in the room
But
backed
that's
away.
impossible.
Inside the grand halls of the obsidian palace, warmth flickered from countless candles, their light casting long shadows on the marble floors. The air inside was thick with anticipation. Tonight was no ordinary night. Tonight the king had called a ball, an event whispered about in every corner of the kingdom, a gathering that only the brave or the foolish would dare to attend. King Corvath was a man of legend. His presence alone could silence a room. Men and women alike spoke of him in hushed tones of the curse he carried, and the strange, almost magnetic pull he had over those who dared approach him. No one really knew the truth about him, except that he was feared, admired, and utterly untouchable. Lady Aloan adjusted the silver clasp at her throat, feeling the weight of the evening press upon her. She was tall, with hair like spun midnight and eyes that reflected the firelight. Her family had been loyal to the crown for generations, yet she had never felt comfortable among the gilded walls and silken gowns of the palace. And yet, something had drawn her here tonight, a whisper in the wind, a hint of destiny that she could neither name nor resist. The doors to the ballroom opened with a heavy creak, and Aloan stepped inside. The music swelled immediately, the haunting strains of a lute and violin filling the space like a living creature. Couples moved in graceful circles, laughter and soft chatter blending with the notes of the instruments. But all of this, luxury, music, and beauty, was overshadowed by one presence. He stood near the throne, tall and imposing, his dark robes trailing behind him like a shadow stretched by candlelight. Eyes the color of storm clouds scanned the room, and at once every man in the room felt the chill of his gaze. Even the most confident courtiers shrank back, unwilling to meet him directly. Corvath's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but enough to make those who dared to watch shiver. When he spoke, it was not loud, but it filled the hall with authority. "Dance with me, or I'll lose my patience." A murmur ran through the crowd. Every man who had hoped to gain favor with the king recoiled. It was not a threat as much as it was a promise, a challenge none dared accept. And yet, despite the danger in his words, every eye in the room turned toward him, drawn to the command as if it were a siren's call. Eloan's heart quickened. Her pulse felt ill. The others were frozen in fear, but she was captivated by the storm in his eyes, by the tension that hung around him like a cloak. Something about him called to her, not in a way that frightened her, but in a way that made her feel alive, exposed, and strangely safe. Corvath's gaze fell on her, and she felt the world narrow until it was only the two of them. His eyes held a question, a challenge, and something more, a recognition of something hidden within her that even she had not fully understood. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her chest, a mixture of fear and longing that made it hard to breathe. He extended his hand, long and strong, gloved in black silk. "Come," he said, his voice low, carrying a command that was impossible to refuse. Aloan hesitated, then stepped forward. Every step felt heavy, yet thrilling, as if each footfall drew her closer to a destiny she had never imagined. She placed her hand in his, and immediately a current of something unspoken passed between them. It was not merely attraction, it was recognition, a spark that hinted at danger, passion, and the possibility of change. The music shifted, a slow, haunting melody filling the room as the other dancers watched in awe. Corvath guided her into the center of the hall. Every movement was precise, powerful yet smooth, as if he were both a predator and a poet. Aloan tried to match his steps, her own movements clumsy at first, but gradually finding rhythm under his steady guidance. "You move well for one so cautious," he said quietly, close enough that she could feel his breath, warm against her ear. I try," she replied, her voice barely audible over the music, though she felt as though he could hear every thought, every hesitation. "Try," he repeated, the single word carrying both challenge and amusement. You can do more than try, Aloan. You must. The hall seemed to shrink around them. Other dancers faded into the background, their colors dull compared to the intensity of the king before her. She could feel the strength in his grip, not violent but demanding, insistent, and it awakened something deep inside her, a courage she had not known she possessed. They moved together slowly at first, then with more confidence. The dance became a conversation, a battle, a delicate negotiation of control and surrender. Every glance, every touch was charged with meaning, though neither spoke aloud. She felt the power in him, the danger, and yet somehow the loneliness that must lie beneath the crown he wore so heavily. A hush fell over the room as the music reached its climax. Even the servants stopped to watch, their breaths caught in their throats. Aloan felt her heart pound in rhythm with the music and with the king's movements. He was not merely dancing. He was testing her, inviting her into a world she had only glimpsed in dreams and whispers. "You are not afraid," he observed, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her chest. I am," she admitted, "but not of you." His eyes flickered, briefly revealing a shadow of surprise, then something else, something softer, buried beneath layers of pride and fear. "Interesting," he murmured. "Few have the courage to speak so honestly to me." They spun once more, the world blurring into candlelight and shadow. Aloan felt a thrill, a pull she could not explain, as though the very air around them recognized their connection. Yet, even as the dance continued, a subtle unease gnawed at her. There was power here, yes, but also danger, something ancient and restless, waiting for the wrong step to strike. Suddenly, the music ended. The final note lingered like a sigh. Corvath's hand lingered on hers, his gaze locked on her face. Silence fell, thick and expectant, the room holding its breath. "You survived the first test," he said, voice quiet but commanding. "But the night has only just begun." Aloan's heart leapt. She understood then that this was more than a dance. It was a challenge, a game of shadows and fire, a test of courage and will. And for reasons she could not explain, she wanted to continue to see where this dangerous path would lead. The other guests murmured, exchanging nervous glances, but no one dared approach. Corvath's presence was like a storm contained within human form, beautiful, terrifying, and impossible to ignore. "Tell me," he asked softly, leaning closer so that only she could hear, "do you understand the stakes?" Aloan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his gaze. "I think I want to." A faint smile touched his lips, fleeting and enigmatic. "Good. Courage is the first step. The rest we will discover together." As he released her hand, she felt a strange emptiness, as though the room itself had been drained of light, leaving only her heartbeat and the echo of the king's presence. And then, just as quickly, the candles flared, shadows dancing wildly across the walls. Aloan's eyes searched for him, but Corvath had already vanished into the deeper corridors of the palace, leaving her with a mixture of exhilaration and unease. The other guests whispered behind her back, but she did not care. She had glimpsed a force beyond fear and power, a storm contained in a single human being, and she knew, without a doubt, that she would see him again. Tonight had changed everything. The dance had only just begun, and somewhere deep inside she felt the pull of destiny tighten its grip. Somewhere in the darkened corridors of the palace, the king waited, and the shadow of what was to come whispered her name. The palace corridors were silent now, but not empty. Lady Aloan's steps echoed softly on the polished marble, each one carrying her closer to the unknown heart of the obsidian palace. The candles along the walls flickered as if stirred by some invisible presence, their flames bending toward shadows that moved of their own accord. Somewhere in the distance, a clock told midnight, its deep sound vibrating through the halls like a warning. Aloan's thoughts spun faster than her footsteps. The king, the man who had dared to command her to dance, was unlike anyone she had ever known. Not simply because of his power, his presence, or his legendary status, but because of the weight in his eyes, the storm that lurked just beneath his calm exterior. She could feel it in her bones. To know him was to risk being changed forever. And yet, she could not stop herself. She rounded a corner and found herself in a hall lined with tall mirrors, each reflecting candlelight in 1,000 fractured ways. For a moment, she saw herself, her own reflection, but altered. In her eyes burned the memory of the dance, the brush of the king's hand against hers, the faint thrill that had leapt through her veins. Her pulse thrummed with a mixture of fear and longing, and she realized with a shiver that part of her wanted to feel that thrill again. A soft sound behind her made her spin. There he was, Corvath, emerging from the shadows as if he had been part of them all along. He moved with a predator's grace, yet there was a hesitation in his gaze, a spark of something almost human beneath the mask of authority. "You did not run," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to echo in the mirrored hall. "I did not see a reason to," Eloin replied, her voice steadier than she felt. I wanted to find you." He raised an eyebrow, a mixture of amusement and calculation. "Most would have fled, few would follow curiosity into darkness." "I am not most," she said softly, surprising herself with her own boldness. A shadow of a smile touched his lips. "No, you are not. That is what makes you interesting." He stepped closer, and Eloin felt the air thicken between them, the temperature shifting as though the palace itself recognized the tension. Corvath reached out, not to touch, but to gesture toward the door at the far end of the hall. "Walk with me," he said. "There are places in this palace few are allowed to see. You may find answers there or more questions." Eloin followed. The hall opened into a wide balcony, overlooking the palace gardens blanketed in winter's frost. Moonlight spilled over the landscape, painting the snow in silver and shadows. The wind was biting, but she barely noticed. "Why show me this?" she asked. "Why me?" Corvath's gaze did not waver. "Because you are not afraid to look at what others refuse to see. The world is not built for comfort alone. It is built for power, for fear, and for those who can walk its edge without falling." She shivered, not from cold but from the weight of his words. "And do you fear?" The question seemed to hang in the air, daring him to answer. For a long moment he said nothing. Then finally, "I fear only that which I cannot control. Everything else, I bend to my will." And yet in the set of his jaw and the flicker of his eyes there was a tension that belied the words, a vulnerability that he would not name. They walked together along the balcony, their silence speaking volumes. Eloin sensed that Corvath's life was a careful construction of fear and respect, a kingdom held together by the weight of a crown and the secrets beneath it. And in the same breath, she sensed his loneliness, the isolation that came from being above all others, from being feared rather than understood. "You move through fear as though it were a companion," he said suddenly. "It is rare to see someone not crushed by the weight of this palace, by the shadow of the crown." Eloin looked at him, meeting his gaze fully for the first time. "I have learned to live with shadows, and perhaps to dance with them." Corvath's lips curved slightly. "A fitting metaphor for tonight," he murmured, "and for what may come." The wind picked up, swirling around them, lifting strands of her hair and carrying the faint scent of frost and smoke. He gestured toward the gardens below, where statues of forgotten kings and queens loomed in the moonlight, their stone faces frozen in expressions of judgment and despair. "This garden was once a place of celebration," he said. "Now it is a reminder. Every king, every ruler carries a shadow, some larger than others, some darker." Eloin nodded, her eyes tracing the frozen paths and statues. "And your shadow is larger than most." Corvath paused, studying her. "Perhaps, or perhaps it only appears so because you notice it." "Few do." There was a long silence, filled only by the wind and the distant sound of the sea crashing against the cliffs. Finally he spoke again, his voice softer, almost intimate. "Tell me, Eloin, do you believe in curses?" Her brow furrowed. "Curses, like magic." "Yes," he said simply, and in the power they hold over those who ignore them. She thought of the whispers she had heard about him, the tales of a king haunted by forces beyond understanding, bound by a darkness that fed on desire and fear alike. I, I do not know, she admitted. Perhaps, but I know fear can feel very real even without magic. He nodded slowly as though he had been waiting for that answer. True, fear is the first chain, the second is loneliness, and the third is desire. Desire can break even the strongest. Aloan's heartbeat quickened at his words, as if he had spoken directly to something deep inside her. She wanted to speak, to argue, but no words came. Instead, she felt the gravity of his presence pull at her, and in that moment she understood that this king, this man, was a storm she had no choice but to face. "Come," he said, moving back toward the palace. "I will show you something few have seen." He led her through a series of winding corridors, each darker and quieter than the last, until they reached a small chamber hidden behind a tapestry of silver thread. The room was filled with relics, ancient tomes, gilded mirrors, and artifacts that shimmered with faint, unearthly light. The air was heavy with history and secrets, and Aloan felt both awe and unease. "These are fragments," he explained, "of what has come before. Kings, queens, and rulers who thought themselves invincible and yet fell, all bound by choices, by fear, and by desire." She moved closer to a mirror etched with symbols she did not recognize, tracing the patterns with her finger. "And you, where do you fall?" Corvath stepped behind her close enough that she felt the warmth of him, the presence of him. "I do not fall," he said quietly. "I endure, but even I am not beyond the reach of what lies in the shadows." Her hand hesitated on the glass. "And yet you invite me here." "Into your shadows." His breath was near her ear, low and steady. "Because you see, Aloan, even shadows need light, and you may be the light that changes me." Her pulse raced. His words were both frightening and thrilling, stirring something she could not name. She felt exposed, yet strangely safe in his presence. He was a storm and she was a spark, yet together the air between them felt charged, as though magic itself had stirred. Suddenly, the quiet was broken by the soft sound of footsteps outside the chamber. The echo of the palace reminded them that danger, curiosity, and politics never rested. Corvath stiffened, his hand brushing hers, not in anger but in warning. "You must be careful," he said. "The walls of this palace have ears, and not all shadows are friendly." Aloan looked at him, her heart full of conflicting emotions. "I do not care," she whispered. "I want to know the truth, even if it scares me." Corvath's eyes softened just for a moment before the mask of the king returned. "Then you must follow me, trust me. And remember, even the bravest sometimes stumble in the dark." He took her hand again, and together they moved deeper into the palace, toward secrets that few had seen, toward challenges that would test their courage and their hearts. And as they disappeared into the shadows, the wind outside seemed to howl louder, as if the world itself had taken notice of their alliance, and the storm that was coming. Aloan knew, without doubt, that tonight had changed her. She was no longer merely a guest at the king's ball. She was part of a dance far older and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. A dance of power, of longing, and of shadows that demanded both courage and trust. And somewhere in the corridors behind her, the king watched her every step, his heart stirring in ways he had long thought impossible. The deeper they walked into the obsidian palace, the colder the air became. The corridors seemed alive, twisting and bending in ways that made it impossible to remember the path they had taken. Candles flickered nervously in their sconces, casting long, quivering shadows along the walls. Aloan's heart beat faster with each step, both from anticipation and from the quiet fear that something unseen watched them. Corvath moved ahead of her with the certainty of a man who knew every stone, every secret of the palace. He did not speak much, but the occasional glance he threw over his shoulder was enough to remind her that he was always aware, always protective, even as he seemed almost indifferent to the dangers surrounding them. Finally, they reached a large iron door, etched with strange symbols that pulsed faintly in the darkness. Corvath placed his hand on the door, and it swung open silently, revealing a chamber lit by an eerie, pale blue light. The room was unlike any part of the palace she had seen before. It was vast, almost cathedral-like, with high ceilings that disappeared into darkness. In the center stood a pedestal, and on it rested an orb of black crystal, swirling with shadowy mist that seemed alive. Around it were scattered relics, ancient books, broken crowns, and statues of creatures she did not recognize. "This is," Eloan began, her voice trembling with awe and fear. "The heart of the curse," Corvath said simply, stepping closer to the pedestal. His eyes were dark, stormy, and filled with a weight she could not name. "This orb binds me. It feeds on fear, desire, and loneliness. It gives me power, but it also demands a price." Eloan took a careful step forward, her gaze fixed on the orb. The shadows within it twisted and writhed as if aware of her presence. "A curse like this, can it be broken?" Corvath's expression darkened. "I do not know, many have tried. Some were consumed, some vanished entirely. I have endured for decades, holding it at bay, but it grows stronger with each passing year." Eloan's hand reached out instinctively, though she hesitated before touching the crystal. She could feel the cold radiating from it, and an odd pull, as if it wanted to draw her in. "And yet you invited me here. Why?" Corvath turned to her, his face unreadable. "Because you are different. You do not fear what others would. You feel deeply. And sometimes deep feeling is the only thing that can challenge a curse." Her breath caught. She wanted to ask more, wanted to know what exactly he meant. But before she could speak, the orb shivered violently, and a shadow erupted from it, coiling around the room like smoke. The air became heavy, almost suffocating, and a cold wind whipped through the chamber despite the lack of windows. "Stay behind me," Corvath said, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. The shadow took form, a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to hum with malice. It whispered in a language she could not understand, voices of those long gone, echoes of broken dreams and forgotten sorrows. Eloan felt a chill run down her spine, but she did not step back. "You are not afraid," the shadow hissed, though she could not tell if it was speaking to her or to him. "I am," she admitted aloud, surprising herself. "But not of you." Corvath's eyes flicked to her, a flicker of admiration and something warmer passing through his gaze. "Good," he murmured. "Fear can be controlled. Courage is rare." The shadow pulsed violently and surged toward them, but Corvath moved like lightning. He drew a small, obsidian dagger from his cloak and struck at the edges of the darkness. The shadow recoiled, hissing, and the orb trembled on the pedestal. "Do you feel it?" Corvath asked, his hand still on hers. "The weight of it." Eloan nodded, though her mind reeled. The shadows pressed against her thoughts, whispering doubts and fears she had never faced. And yet in Corvath's presence she felt a strength she did not know she had. "You have power too," he said softly. "The curse does not control you, not yet. That is why you are here." Her gaze met his, and she saw in him a mixture of hope and despair. "And if I fail," she asked, her voice barely audible. "Then it will consume me," he said quietly, his eyes darkening. "And I have spent too long living in that shadow to be taken by it without a fight." They approached the orb together. The shadows recoiled slightly as they neared, as if recognizing a change in balance. Eloan felt the pull again, stronger now, tugging at something deep within her. She realized with a jolt that part of the curse sought not just him, but her too, her fear, her desire, her courage. "Focus on me," Corvath whispered, his hand firm around hers. "Do not let it reach your heart." She nodded, drawing a steadying breath. Their hands met over the surface of the orb. The moment their skin touched the cold crystal, a shock of energy passed through them both. Images flickered before her eyes, Visions of the king as a boy, alone in a cold, empty castle, glimpses of battles fought in silence, of power wielded and lost, shadows of those who had tried to claim his throne and failed. She gasped. This is all of it. All the pain, all the fear, Corveth nodded, his jaw tight. Every moment of it, every choice, every loss, it is bound here. It grows stronger because I have carried it too long alone. And then the orb began to crack. A faint light spilled from the fissures, revealing glimpses of another world beyond, one of warmth, sunlight, and laughter. Yet the shadows fought back, surging with renewed intensity. "You can help me," he said urgently, his eyes locking on hers. "You can help me end this. But you must trust me completely, not just with your hand, but with your heart." Eloin's heart pounded. Trusting him was easy in one sense. She had been drawn to him from the moment they met. But to offer her heart so fully, in the face of such darkness, was terrifying. And yet, as she looked at him, she saw not only the storm but also the man beneath it, strong, broken, yet still capable of light. I trust you," she whispered, feeling her courage strengthen with each word. "I will try." Corvath's lips curved in a faint, relieved smile. "Then together we can end this." The shadows surged again, writhing and twisting with anger. Corvath and Eloin pressed their hands firmly to the orb, concentrating not on the darkness around them, but on each other. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the shadows began to retreat, dissolving like mist under the morning sun. Corvath's breathing was heavy, his strength tested to its limits, but he did not falter. Eloin's heart beat in rhythm with his, and she realized that their connection, this bond of courage, trust, and unspoken understanding, was the key to breaking the curse. The orb cracked further, and suddenly, with a bright flash of silver-blue light, the shadows scattered completely. The chamber was silent again, save for the faint hum of energy dissipating into the walls. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time in decades, Corvath breathed freely. He turned to her, his eyes dark but softer than before. "You have done what none could. You faced the shadows and did not waver." Eloin stepped back, exhausted but exhilarated. "We did it together." "Yes," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "Together." For a long moment they simply stood there, hands still touching, hearts still beating in rhythm. Outside the chamber, the palace seemed to exhale, as though it too had waited centuries for this moment. But even in victory, Eloin sensed that the night was not yet over. The curse had been challenged, but its echoes remained, less powerful but still present. And she realized that Corvath's journey toward redemption would not end here. Neither would her own path toward understanding him, or the storm that had drawn them together in the first place. Finally, Corvath spoke, his voice gentle but commanding. "Come with me. There are still questions to answer, and there is much you must learn before the dawn." Eloin followed him into the corridors once more, her mind spinning with everything she had seen. She had faced shadows, touched power, and glimpsed the man behind the king. And in her heart she felt the first stirrings of something new, something dangerous, something beautiful, something that could bind her to him in ways she could not yet name. As they walked, the distant wind outside rose again, carrying with it whispers of storms yet to come. The palace seemed alive around them, aware of the bond that had been forged in the heart of darkness. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, the last remnants of the curse watched and waited, not for Corvath's fall, but for the next choice, one that could change everything again. Eloin did not know what awaited them, but she knew one thing with certainty. Her life and her heart would never be the same. And neither would the king's. Dawn broke over the obsidian palace in shades of molten gold and crimson, spilling light over the frost-covered gardens. The winter storm had passed, leaving the air sharp and clear, as if the world itself had taken a deep breath. But inside the palace, the aftermath of the night's trials lingered like a silent echo. Shadows had retreated, but the memory of their presence clung to the walls, as though the stones themselves remembered the battle that had taken place in the heart of the cursed chamber. Lady Aloin stood at the top of a grand staircase, her hand resting lightly on the railing. Her breath came in quiet, uneven waves, her body still trembling from the events of the night. She had faced darkness, walked into the heart of a curse, and survived. And yet the thought of what lay ahead made her chest tighten. Not fear exactly, but anticipation, the weight of destiny pressing gently upon her shoulders. At the base of the staircase, Corvath waited. His dark robes were smoothed and untroubled now, though his eyes carried the faint traces of the storm he had endured. The light of dawn caught the angles of his face, softening the harsh lines that had once seemed carved from shadow itself. To Aloin he looked both terrifying and magnificent, a man shaped by power, fear, and solitude, yet somehow capable of redemption. "You are ready," he said quietly, stepping forward. His voice was low, calm, but beneath it lay a current of emotion she had never heard before. "This is the moment where choice becomes action, where courage becomes something more." Aloin nodded. "I am ready," she said, though her heart raced. "What must we do?" He extended his hand toward her, not commanding but inviting. "We must dance," he said, his lips curving into the faintest smile. "Not as ruler and guest, not as king and noblewoman, but as two who have faced the storm together. The curse is strong, but it is bound by the rhythm of hearts. We must move as one, and it will either break or endure." The palace had emptied in the early hours, leaving the grand ballroom eerily silent, except for the soft sound of their footsteps on the marble floor. Candles had been relit along the walls, their flames flickering like golden sentinels. In the center of the room, the air shimmered faintly, the residue of the curse's power twisting like mist across the floor. Aloin stepped forward, feeling both awe and fear. This final dance would determine everything: the future of the king, the fate of the palace, and perhaps even the lives of those bound by shadow and fear. She took a deep breath, letting the rhythm of her heartbeat guide her. Corvath took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Trust me," he murmured. "Trust yourself." The music began, soft at first, like the distant murmur of wind through frozen trees. Then slowly a melody filled the hall, rising in a steady, haunting rhythm. They moved together, their steps cautious at first, testing, learning. But gradually the dance grew stronger, more confident, more precise. It was not merely a dance. It was a battle and a communion, a conversation of movement that spoke of courage, desire, and redemption. Aloin felt the weight of the past pressing against her, the shadows of fear, of doubt, of loneliness. And yet, with each step, each turn, she realized that she was no longer alone. Corvath's presence was a tether, a strength that allowed her to face the darkness within and around them. "You have done well," he said softly, his lips brushing near her ear. "But now comes the heart of it." The shadows flickered along the edges of the room, remnants of the curse that had once consumed Corvath. They coiled and writhed, testing, challenging, whispering doubts and fears that clawed at Aloin's mind. "You cannot do this. You are too weak, you cannot save him." She closed her eyes briefly, drawing a deep breath. "I am stronger than my fear. I can face this." Opening her eyes, she met Corvath's gaze. The intensity there was almost unbearable, a mixture of longing, trust, and something deeper that neither word nor touch could fully express. And in that shared understanding, the shadows recoiled slightly, as if acknowledging the bond they had formed. The dance accelerated, a whirlwind of motion and emotion. Every step, every turn, every lift and pivot was precise, deliberate, a weaving of two hearts into one rhythm. Aloin felt the power of the curse pressing against her, but she held firm, trusting in the connection they shared. Corvath moved with equal determination, his strength and focus protecting them both as they spun and dipped in perfect harmony. And then, with a sudden surge of light from the center of the room, the shadows cried out as if in pain. The orb, the heart of the curse, had reappeared, floating above the pedestal, pulsating with dark energy. But something had changed. It was weaker now, flickering like a dying flame. The bond between Corvath and Aloan was strong, and it pushed against the curse, forcing it to retreat. "You are doing it," Corvath exclaimed, his voice carrying over the music. "Do not falter. Keep moving, feel the rhythm of your hearts." Aloan could feel her own fear melting into something else. Determination, trust, and even something fragile but real. Love. Not the fleeting passion of danger, but a deep connection born of shared struggle, of courage in the face of shadows, of hearts reaching for light. The orb pulsed one final time, brighter than the sun through frozen clouds, then shattered into 1,000 shards of silver and light. The shadows dissolved instantly, their whispers silenced. The palace itself seemed to exhale, the heavy air of years of darkness lifting in a wave of warmth and clarity. For a moment, neither moved. The music hung in the air, fading to silence, leaving only the sound of their own breathing. Aloan's hand still rested in Corvath's, and she felt the steady beat of his pulse through their touch. "It is over," she whispered, almost in disbelief. "Yes," Corvath said, his voice quiet but firm. "The curse is broken. The shadows are gone." And yet he hesitated, studying her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Yet we are changed. I am changed. And perhaps you are too." Aloan looked at him, the morning light catching in his eyes, revealing the man beneath the storm. The man who had endured decades of fear and loneliness, who had lived in the weight of a curse, and who had allowed her to step into his heart, into his life. "I am," she admitted softly, "and I think I am ready to see what comes next." He stepped closer, closing the space between them. "Then come," he said gently, "not as king and guest, not as ruler and subject, but as two who have faced the darkness together." And then in the quiet of the palace they danced again. Not as a test, not as a challenge, but as a celebration. Every movement was free, every step a choice, every turn an expression of the bond they had forged. The ballroom, once shadowed and tense, now glowed with the light of redemption, of hope, and of the future they would face together. Aloan laughed softly, the sound like wind through chimes, and Corvath's lips curved into a rare, genuine smile. For the first time in decades, the king's eyes were not stormy with fear or shadowed by curse. They were clear, bright, and full of life. As the final notes of their dance faded into silence, they stood together in the center of the room, hands entwined, hearts beating in perfect rhythm. The palace seemed to hum around them, as if acknowledging their triumph, their courage, and their love. Corvath looked down at Aloan, his voice low but tender. "Now will you dance with me freely?" Aloan smiled, her eyes shining. "Yes," she said, with a certainty that filled both of them. "Freely." The storm had passed, the curse had ended, and the shadows had been banished. But more importantly, a new beginning had begun. One born not of power or fear, but of courage, trust, and the quiet strength of hearts willing to face darkness together. Outside, the first rays of the sun glinted over the frozen gardens, touching the statues of past kings and queens, the marble paths, and the walls of the obsidian palace. Inside, two souls stood at the center of their own destiny, bound not by fear, but by choice, courage, and the unspoken promise of what was yet to come. And in that moment the palace was alive with light, the shadows no longer waiting, and the dance, once a test, once a trial, had become a celebration of life, love, and redemption. They would face the future together. Whatever storms might come, whatever shadows might rise, they would face them as one. And for the first time, both knew the true meaning of freedom and of love.